Behind me is the Goodsprings School. It used to be called the Goodsprings Grammar School. And back in the days when I was growing up, grammar school was the first 8 grades of your education. You went from grammar school to high school. I went to grades 1 through 5 here and the first half of the 6th grade. Then the family moved to St. George for 6 months, St. George, Utah for 6 months, then came back, and I did the 7th grade here in this school, and then the family moved to St. George for good. The school is the school has many really good memories for me. It was a good school. We had a good school teacher. Miss Sarah Ann Williams taught me in school every year except the 1st grade. When there was a young lady named Bornia, Miss Bornia, came out from Las Vegas and took the first 4 grades while Miss Williams was in the grades 5 through 8. That's Sarah Ann Williams. She was a Welsh lady born and raised in Wales. She always made fun of her name, Sarah Ann Williams. She told us all that it was good luck when the initials of your name spelled a word. And she was doubly lucky because hers spelled a word both backwards and forwards. S-A-W and W-A-S. Anyway, very kind lady. There was a willow switch that hung on the wall behind her desk, which she occasionally used, but not real often. My cousin Stanley McIver was probably the most frequent recipient of the willow, as he was always getting into trouble. My best friend Ronnie Mayo lived here in town. He lived just up here in a little shack just up on the side of the hill over here. And he and I used to get into a lot of mischief together, but largely I was a loner. My dad gave me a .22 rifle when I was about 9 years old, I guess, and taught me how to shoot. And shooting came naturally to me. I quickly became a very good shot. And after I got my rifle and learned to shoot, I brought a lot of rabbits back home for dinner. Dinner was usually either rabbit or chicken. We had a chicken coop in our backyard, and we ate the chickens and we ate the eggs. Had a pen of pigeons, and we ate the pigeons and we ate their eggs too, although it took a lot of pigeon eggs to make a breakfast. But they were tasty. And my dad would often buy a turkey or two to run around the yard, and then come Thanksgiving time we'd have turkey dinner. Generally it was my job to kill the chickens. I'd catch one, check to make sure it wasn't a layer, that it had gone into a dormant state, and then I'd chop off its head and hang it on the clothesline to dry, to bleed out. So that was my job, that and providing rabbits for the family's dinner. When I was about 9 and a half, I guess, my dad gave me a set of traps that he'd used as a boy and taught me how to trap. And so for the next couple of years I trapped the desert, the area down south of us here, and caught coyotes, bobcat, and lynx, and I'd cure the pelts and send them down to Sears Roebuck, and they'd come back with a money order for what the pelt was worth. But largely, often, most days that were not school days, if Ronnie Mayo and I weren't getting into mischief of some kind, I'd usually be caught out in the desert here someplace to the north of us with my .22, just out enjoying being alone in the desert. If I happened to find a rabbit for dinner, that was fine. If not, I was having a good time anyway. Life growing up in Goodsprings was pretty casual, The roads were all dirt roads. They weren't paved then like they are now. They were all dirt roads. We didn't have any electricity, so we used mostly kerosene lanterns to light the evenings, do our schoolwork by the kerosene lantern, and read newspapers and funny papers and comic books by the kerosene lanterns. My dad was very good with electronics and electricity, and he had one of the few radios in town that would really get long-range stations. They were battery powered, of course. We had no electricity, so they had 3 big batteries. There was an A battery, a B battery, and a C battery in the radios. The B battery was a big, heavy battery that provided most of the positive voltage for the circuits in the radio. And then there were smaller batteries, a C battery and an A battery, that would take care of the other electronic functions of the radio. But my dad built an antenna. It was about, I imagine it was 25 or 30 feet tall, and erected it in the side yard of our house, and then strung a long wire to another pole that was on down further to the west, and by properly calculating the length of the cable between the 2 pillars, he was able to get a resonant frequency and pull in some stations that were pretty long distance. He could pull in KSL from Salt Lake City clearly with that setup. And so we had a radio, and a lot of times people from around the town, if there was something special going on, they'd come up to our house to listen to the radio and hear the news of what was going on. While living here, I took piano lessons from a lady named Roma Knight, who was just an outstanding musician. And she taught me to play the piano and the harmonica and the tonette. And she had a radio station, a radio program on the radio station in Las Vegas, radio station KENO. And Mrs. Knight would go in once a week, and she had a 15-minute program advertising Wonder Bread. And as I got better on the piano, she'd invite me and sometimes my cousin Marilyn, and we'd go into Las Vegas with her, and she let us play a piece on the radio for the Wonder Bread advertisement. And that was a lot of fun. On those occasions when either Marilyn or I were in Las Vegas with Mrs. Knight, everybody would gather around their radios here and listen to the local children playing on the radio. So that was a lot of fun. One year, Mrs. Knight organized just about every kid in town into a harmonica and tonette band. That sounds kind of unlikely, but it turned out pretty good as we learned to play our instruments. And she taught us all Christmas carols and put together a Christmas program. And we went into Las Vegas and played our Christmas program over the radio station KENO that year for Christmas to her accompaniment on the piano. And that was a lot of fun. A lot of fun. One year, my friend Ronnie Mayo and I, we usually got into mischief, but this one year we got creative one summer. And we found some old scrap lumber and some scrap sheet metal, and we built ourselves a little mercantile stand just right up here, just north of the main road out of town on the south side of town. And we sold cups of root beer and 7-Up out of that, and orange juice, orange sodas out of that for $0.10 a cup. And we were just doing a booming business. Kids from all over, and even some of the adults would come over and buy a cup of soda pop from us. And we'd take our earnings and run down to the store, which was just right over there, buy some more bottles of pop and take them up and sell them for $0.10 a cup. And we were doing really good business. And finally, the lady that actually owned the property where we had our little stand set up, her name was Zella Smith. She came over and made us tear it down. She didn't like it on her little property there by her house, and so she made us tear it down, and there went our business. But we had a really good time putting that business together for a while. I think I have to tell the next story in two parts. One is, I commented earlier that Goodsprings was pretty laid-back town, and that's true. We had a town constable who kept the law, kept the peace, within reason. He did enjoy his evenings in the Pioneer Bar down the street here. So if anything really serious came up, you could find him down there and get him to come out and take care of anything that was very serious. Other than that, he usually leave people alone. But the second part of the story now, when I was about 9 or 10, my dad taught me how to make explosives. And I'm not going to describe the method that we used because the materials are still available. But it gave us access to nearly unlimited supply of black powder. And what we were thinking of as heavy-duty firecrackers were actually pipe bombs that he taught us how to make. And so we had good time setting off pipe bombs around the city here, around the town of Goodsprings, and out in the mountains around us. I made a little cannon one day. I took a piece of plumbing pipe about that long and put a plumbing nipple on the end of it, put some black powder in and tamped it in and run a fuse through the small end of the nipple, and then put some marbles in the barrel. Propped it up on some rocks just right over the hill here, unthinkingly aiming it toward the town. And I lit the fuse and it went off, and sure enough it worked just like a cannon, and those marbles went sailing out across the desert and landed on the roof of my dad's boss's house just right over here and made quite a little rattle as the marbles landed on his roof. Now back to the constable. The constable, after we'd been doing this for several weeks, the constable caught me right here in front of the schoolhouse one day as school let out, and he said, "Now, Raymond, you're being real careful with those explosives, aren't you?" And I said, "Yes, sir." He says, "Well, just see that you don't hurt anybody." And that was the end of that, and he went back to the bar down here in the saloon. There's one story that the family is insisting that I tell. One evening I decided I was going to see what happened if I made an explosive out of a tire pump. So I took the plunger out of the pump and I put, maybe 2 inches of black powder in the bottom, and I ran a fuse in through the hole where the hose hooked onto the pump, and I put the plunger back on and screwed it on tight, put it out in the middle of the road here in front of the hotel, lit the fuse, and ran for cover. I wasn't sure whether the pump would explode or whether it would blow off or what it would do. Well, wound up blowing the top off the pump, and the top went 150, 200 feet in the air, and came down right on the roof of the hotel and punched a hole through the roof of the hotel. And of course I ran like crazy and never got caught, fortunately. But I think that's the only time that we actually did any damage with our explosives. My brothers and I and Ronnie as we were growing up. Part of being a laid-back town, the boys in town would go barefoot every summer. And we'd usually start about 2 weeks before school let out, we'd take our shoes off and start going to school barefooted. And I hope the camera is picking up the gravel around, because that's just what it was then. All over town was gravel and rocks. And we'd take our shoes off and walk on this, and we'd develop calluses on the bottom of our feet that were as thick as shoe soles. And when we got our calluses on, we could go any place on these mountains and run through the mountains and over the rocks, and nothing would hurt us. But then in the fall, my dad would take all the boys in our family into Las Vegas and buy us all new shoes for the beginning of school year. And so we all had new shoes, and we'd come to school all wearing new shoes. As you might imagine, the soles on the shoes didn't always last a long time with this gravel and rock terrain that we were walking on. And the soles would often wear out well before we started to go barefoot. And so my dad became very expert with the shoemaker's last, and he would re-sole the shoes for us and put new soles on the shoes that would last us until we were ready to take our shoes off and go barefoot again. So that was the usual routine. But one year, my brothers and I wore our shoes out within weeks after school started. And my dad got really mad. And instead of re-soling us using standard leather, he went and got an old used tire and cut the tire tread and re-soled our shoes, all of us, with tire tread for shoe soles. And so from then on, for the rest of that school year, every place we went, we left tire tread shoe tracks every place we went. And the other boys were so jealous of the Kemple family boys that had shoe tracks for soles on their shoes. Oh, and then there's the times that the hill up here behind us got caught on fire. There's one time, I don't remember this story really well, but I do remember that my brother Jim and some of his friends were up there on the side hill, and I guess they were playing with matches according to the story, and they managed to set the hill on fire.
They found a bottle of vanilla that had kerosene in it, and so they took that to see if they could start a bush on fire. And so they took some matches, which they were not supposed to have either, and they took it out and they dumped that kerosene all over the bush. Jim was telling me this story.
Okay.
Dumped it all over the bush and set the bush on fire. And the wind blows here almost all the time, and so as you might expect, that kerosene caught on fire and burned that bush really fast, and it spread really fast. And it got away from them, and they got scared and started to run away, and so they called a fire alert, and they had to pull some of the miners from the mines and to come in and help put out the fire that Jim and his friend had started. So.
Okay, thank you. The other time I can remember the hill being set on fire was by my dad. Every year, my dad would save money all year long and buy an enormous fireworks display for the 4th of July. And at our house up here on the side of the hill, people from all over town would gather in our front yard and up the street up to our house to watch the fireworks. And they were really big, expensive firework displays. And so this one year, Dad was busy lighting the fireworks, and one of them hadn't burned completely and landed on the side hill and caught the hill on fire from his fireworks one evening. And so he and all the men from town that were watching the fireworks grabbed shovels and buckets and went up and put the hill out before it got too badly burned. After that, we didn't set the fireworks off. My dad still bought the fireworks every year, but instead of setting them off up at our house, we'd go over to the dry lake bed over by Roach, which is about 7 miles, about 10 miles, I guess, from here. And we'd camp out on the dry lake bed overnight on the 4th of July, and we'd set off our fireworks over there on the dry lake bed where they couldn't do any damage.
You know, I look at that hill and it looks pretty good, and I'm wondering how many times it's been set on fire since the Kemples lived here.
Probably never since we left. Those were the days, good days, fun times, even though they were sometimes a little more mischievous than what you would think about nowadays. We had a good time growing up here. People often ask me where I'm from. The family moved to St. George when I was just before I turned 12. And I never did like St. George, Utah. Never liked it, still don't like it there. If I ever have a choice, as I'm driving through this part of the country, I drive around St. George instead of through it, because I really do not like St. George. But when people ask me where I'm from, my brothers all say, we're from St. George, Utah, but I always say, I'm from Goodsprings, Nevada. This was my home growing up, and I love it here. Still feel good here, still feel the nostalgia of growing up here, and it's just a great place. Even though it's changed so much over the last 80 years since I left.
So, were you actually born really close to Goodsprings, or?
No, not really. Back in those days, there was no hospital. Even in Las Vegas, there was no hospital. And so the men here in the little mining towns like Goodsprings, when their wives were expecting a baby about a month before the baby's due time, they would take their wives to California and set them up down in California, and the hospitals down there had a live-in kind of an arrangement with that they could take them and actually put them in a room in the hospital and board in bed in the hospital while they were waiting for the baby to come. And that's what my dad did for the first three of us. We went down to Burbank, California. He took my mother down to Burbank, and the first three of us were born in Burbank, California, and then came back here as babies to be raised here. The next two boys, after the first three, the next two boys came along after they'd built a hospital in Las Vegas. And so my brothers George and Richard, Chuck and Dick, were born in Las Vegas. The house up here on the hill just behind us, the street beside the school on the west side of the school goes right up the hill to where our house used to stand. My dad and my grandfather each chipped in $250 and bought the materials and built that house up there. And I believe it was built before my dad married my mother. I think he built it with her in mind when he built that house. But they built it with their own hands, and it cost $500 to build, $250 a piece they paid for it. And when we left Goodsprings for good, my dad thought he'd really made a killing when he sold that house for $1,000, and he gave his father, my grandfather, $500 of it to pay for his half of the house that he'd furnished to get it built. He kept $500 and thought he'd really made a killing. The house that stood there when I was growing up doesn't exist anymore. The house that's there now is similar, but not the same as the one I grew up in. But it's still there. That's the site of the Kemple family's residence in Goodsprings. It's long. It wasn't L-shaped at all. It was long. My parents' bedroom was on the west end, and then there was a small kitchen, and then a living room, and then what started out to be a sun porch that eventually got walled in and became the boys' bedroom. I might mention about our kitchen. Most of the families in town had wood stoves, and they would cook on the wood stove and burn wood in the wood stove to heat the house during the wintertime. We were a very upscale family. My mother had a stove that burned gasoline, and she'd fill a little gasoline tank on the end of the stove and pump it up each time she lit the stove. She'd pump it up like a those that are viewing this remember the old Coleman lanterns with the pump on it. That's the way this tank was on our gasoline stove. And she'd pump it up and light the stove and cook on our gasoline stove. So I guess that's cooking with gas. And most of the people in town didn't have refrigeration. Their refrigerators, typically, the way they kept food cool, they'd take boxes that the dynamite had come in that the miners used, powder boxes, and maybe stack one or two on top of each other and put them side by side, drape burlap over them and put the burlap, and bottom of the burlap in pans of water. And the water would seep up through the burlap and evaporate and keep things inside the boxes cool. And that was most people's refrigeration. But again, being an upscale family, my dad bought my mother a refrigerator that burned kerosene. And we had that old kerosene refrigerator. Even after we moved it to Utah and were able to do better, we had that kerosene refrigerator up there for, well, until after I left home. I can remember going up and buying 5-gallon buckets of kerosene and hauling them back down to the house to keep the refrigerator going. Do you remember that refrigerator?
I do not remember. I heard most of you talk about the kerosene refrigerator, but I don't remember it.
Yeah. We also had an upscale stove to heat our house. It burned coal oil. We had a tank of coal oil out in the backyard and piped it into the house to burn in our heater, coal oil heater.
I do remember that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we had the same arrangement when we moved to St. George.
Yeah.
We had a coal oil heater in the house. We had a couple of sheds out in the backyard, and I remember one time my mother wishing to goodness that she could take a shower instead of bathe in an old number 11 wash tub. And she expressed that one day when one of her brothers was visiting. And her brother, I'm trying to remember which one it was. I think it was George, but I may be wrong, but I think it was George. Said, "Oh, I can fix that." And so he built her a shower in one of the sheds out in the backyard. And to build her a shower, what he did, he put a cement floor in with a trough, a little trough that came out of the cement floor and ran out into the yard so that the water from the shower could run out and just spill out into the yard. And then he put a 50-gallon drum on top of the shed. And the way the shower worked was you'd fill that drum with water, let the sun heat it, then you'd go in and take a shower. Turn it off and then refill the tub on top of the shed with more water for the next person. And that was far superior to the baths that we used to get in the number 11 tub for so many years while we were living here with no plumbing, no indoor plumbing. Of course, everybody had an outdoor privy for the calls of nature. Ours was out back and up on the side of the hill a little ways. While we were living here, I was maybe 3 years old or thereabouts. And I can't remember the circumstances, but I was spending a week or two with my grandparents, Grandma and Grandpa Kemple, John Orson Kemple and Kate Connolly Kemple, who lived just down the street here. And Grandpa Kemple wanted to go to Nipton, California to visit some relatives, and so we all got in his old Model T Ford and drove from Goodsprings over to Nipton, California. And while we were in Nipton, Grandpa decided I needed a haircut. And that's all I can remember about Nipton, was getting my first commercial haircut there in Nipton, California. And we went in this barber shop, and I wasn't quite sure what to expect, but the barber was a really nice, friendly, jovial kind of a guy, and he had a little horse there that for when the kids came in. And he set me up on this horse, straddled a horse, said, "Now hold real still," and he went ahead and cut my hair while I was sitting on this little horse in his barber shop. And to me, even though that was my first experience with a haircut, it was a lot of fun. On the sadder side, after we'd moved to St. George, when I was 15 years old, my mother had an old Model A Ford that she'd bought from one of her brothers in Las Vegas, and we'd towed it up to St. George, and wouldn't run. Engine was frozen. It was a Sportster, but the canvas roof was missing. Like I say, it didn't run. It was just in really bad shape. Anyway, with that old Model A Ford, I was 15 years old and going to turn 16 in a few months, and I decided I'm going to buy me a car. I was working in the movie theater in St. George and making a little bit of money. And had saved enough that I could afford a little bit for a car. So my mother offered to sell me hers, that old Model A Ford, just a piece of junk actually. And I told her okay, I'd buy it. Problem was, she charged me full market value for it as if it was a running car. And to make up for that, my dad, with his usual impeccable conscience, took it upon himself to fix that car up and make it run and put a new canvas roof on it and everything, and made it into a really good Model A Ford for me. And I drove that car for a couple of years while I was 16, 17 years old. But one day, my dad was working here in Nevada at the Anchor Mine just south of Goodsprings here, and living with his brother Clifford in Las Vegas. And so my brother Clifford and I and our cousin Stanley decided we were going to come down and visit Goodsprings and surprise my dad, who was working here, and then go back to St. George the same day. So we came down and poked around Goodsprings a bit. We had it kind of timed. I'd kind of timed it so that I could go down and be at the Jean Junction with Highway 91 and the Goodsprings Highway is in time to catch my dad and family as the car drove past on their way back to Las Vegas from the mine. And sure enough, we got there. I pulled up to the stop sign just as they were driving past. And I looked down the highway. There was a car coming, but it was way down the highway. So I pulled out to get behind my dad's car, and that car that had been so far down the highway T-boned my Model A. And the police that came from Las Vegas and investigated the crash site estimated that he was going well over 100 miles an hour when he hit me. But as far as my car went, it ripped the engine clear out of the car and deposited it in a ditch about 60 yards away. My car went airborne, landed on the highway, so that I was on the bottom side, scraping along the highway, and I've still got a scar on my shoulder from where I scraped along the highway. My brother and cousin were on top of me. Actually, Stanley was on top of me and my brother Clifford was on top of him. And as the car came to a stop, Stanley said, "Get off me," to my brother Clifford. And he was able to open the door, which was now on the top of the car, and climb out. And Stanley climbed out and I climbed out. And as I climbed out, I was holding the steering wheel in my hand. it had actually sheared off all the spokes from around the steering wheel, and I was just carrying the ring of the steering wheel as I climbed out of the car. And of course the car was totaled. The highway patrol just pushed it off to the side of the road, where it lay for months after that, until somebody, I don't know what happened to it eventually, but my dad paid me $20 for the engine. Took it out to the mine and hooked it up to a compressor and used it to pump air into the mine. The engine was still perfectly fine running. But that was the end of my Model A Ford. That's the same car that I was driving when I visited Silver Reef. Same car I was driving when I met the girl who was to become my wife, Nidra Eager, in Hurricane.
So what happened to the other car?
Oh, the other car was really a mess. The guy that was driving it, I think, as I remember right, his chest was pretty well crushed against the steering wheel. His wife went flying completely through the windshield and out of the car, and was pretty badly cut up. Her face was pretty mangled, and she was pretty badly cut up. And the police kept looking around for the car. They couldn't find the car that had hit me. And they finally found it in a motel. The car had hit me and glanced off and gone through a parking lot and into a motel and wound up in the last cabin in the motel, clear down on the far side. It was probably 300 or 400 yards from the crash site, inside a motel room. This is probably the most common bush in the desert country. This is the greasewood, sometimes referred to as chaparral and sometimes as a creosote bush. But here in Nevada, where I grew up, it's always a greasewood bush. And it's called greasewood because its leaves feel kind of greasy when you put them in your fingers, and it just burns like crazy when it's on fire. When they bloom, they're just covered with yellow blossoms, and they're really beautiful, especially if you get into a desert of them, into a forest of the greasewood trees. When they're all in bloom, it's just absolutely beautiful, spectacular. They only grow where the ground is quite fertile. So if you see a greasewood forest, you know that if there's any way to get water to it, it'd be really good farmland. In the Salt Lake area, there's actually a street named Greasewood Street. And I met a young lady one day who lived on Greasewood Street, and she was really upset whenever she had to tell anybody her street address, because she was ashamed of living on a street with such an ugly name as Greasewood. So I took a few minutes and explained to her what the greasewood bush really was, and that made her feel a whole lot better. We're in Goodsprings, Nevada, at the Goodsprings Cemetery. This grave is of my great uncle Grover Cleveland Kemple. That's Grandpa John Orson Kemple's brother, the son of John Kemple, the Silver Reef John Kemple. Uncle Cleve, as we called him, was born in Silver Reef, Utah. Served as a machine gunner during the First World War, and was mustard gassed by the Germans. And his lungs were never very good after that, but he lived here in Goodsprings with the rest of the Kemple family. His wife was Annie Laurie Hill, and she drove the school bus from Goodsprings to Las Vegas with the high school kids. This grave here is her father, William B. Hill. I didn't know him well. I only knew him to talk to him once or twice, but Remember one year he tried to grow watermelons, and he had a small watermelon vine, and I snuck down there one day to his house and stole one of his watermelons and took it out in the desert and cut it open, and it was so green I couldn't eat it. But anyway, it was an adventure to steal a watermelon. This branch of the family is one that moved to Fresno when the mine shut down at Goodsprings and the family scattered. Uncle Cleve's family all moved down to Fresno. He lived here in Goodsprings with his family. His wife, Annie Laurie, had been married once before to a man named Smith, and they had 2 children. 2 of the Smith children with her that they raised as their own, and the Smith children, I don't think they were ever adopted, but they took the name Kemple all the same. And we always called them Dwayne Kemple and Ruby Kemple, but they were actually Smiths. And the rest of the family, Cleve Jr., Grover Cleveland Jr., Amy, Mary Bell, we all grew up together up here in Goodsprings. This is the grave of Bert Munsey-Brook. He was the postmaster when I was growing up here. When I was 9, 10, 11 years old, I ran a trap line just in the desert just down south of here, and I'd catch coyotes and bobcats and lynx and ring-tailed cats, and take their pelts and cure their pelts, put a shipping tag on them and bring them up to Munsey-Brook at the post office, and he'd attach a shipping tag and ship them down to Sears Roebuck in Los Angeles. And a few days later I'd have a money order or a check in the mail from Sears for the value of the pelts, and old Bert Munsey-Brook would cash the money order or the check for me and give me the money right there in the post office. The biggest check I got was $10 for a lynx. The bobcats would usually go for around $2.50, and the coyotes would usually be about $1.50. Ringtail cats were between 50 cents and $1, depending on the pelt. That $10 lynx pelt was a real treat for a 10-year-old kid in the middle of the Depression in the 1930's. I probably squandered it on candy or ice cream or something.
Yeah, ice cream would have been a worthy cause.
Yep.
Yeah.
So basically, you were normal.
Yeah, normal. This is the grave of Otto and Cora Schwartz. Didn't know them really well. Cora ran a little store in Goodsprings, what we would nowadays call a boutique. It's where the ladies went to buy needles and thread and yarn and lace and things for their sewing projects. I can remember going into her store with my mother as she bought a few things from Cora Schwartz. Don't think I ever knew her husband Otto very well at all, just to say hello once in a while. This is the grave of Judd Gressman, who lived just down the hill from the Kemple family in Goodsprings. Judd told me once that he'd helped Dad dig the well that we used for well water there for our home. Nice old gentleman. His wife was named Frankie, and she was a gypsy lady. And she attributed her long life to drinking a pint of whiskey every day. And you'd often, every morning, you'd see her in the grocery store buying a pint of whiskey, which she'd take home and drink during the day. She and my mother were pretty good friends. Frankie would come up to the house, just up the hill to the house, and help my mother with her housework some morning. I remember one morning she put some water on my mother's silk flowers, not knowing the difference. And my mother just ignored it and let it go. But afterwards she had to throw her flowers away because Frankie had ruined them. Anyway, that's the Gressman family, Judd and Frankie. Oh, the well. In Goodsprings we didn't have any city water at all. Well, that's not entirely true. The Yellow Pine Mine that owned most of Goodsprings and owned almost all the houses there had a big well down in the center of town with a great huge water tank on top of the tower there. And that provided water for many of the people in Goodsprings, but probably a little more than half of them had their own wells that provided their water, with a windmill that would pump the water up out of the well. In our case, the well was down the hill a ways from the house, and we had a big 10,000 gallon water tank up above the house on the hill. And the windmill would pump the water out of the well and through the pipes up to the water tank up the hill, and then it would gravity drain down into the house to provide us water. For days when the wind didn't blow, we had a gasoline engine on our pump, on our well, that would pump the water up, just go down and start the engine and take the place of the windmill and pump the water up to the tank so it could stay full. The well was, not real deep, maybe 30 or 40 feet, deep enough that you couldn't lean over and see the bottom through the dark, but not way deep. It had a ladder going down that my dad would occasionally have to climb down the ladder and clean the muck out of the receptacle at the bottom where the water was sucked up.
I'm just curious, because I know a little teeny bit about well digging. What mechanism did you use to dig the well with? Did you have like a drill, or like in the old pioneer days where they just had to shovel it, or how'd you do it?
It was dug with a pick and shovel.
All the way down, huh?
All the way down, yeah.
That's work.
It was about, as I recall, the opening to the well was about 4 feet square and lined with railroad ties, which we used as timbers all the way down.
Just like making a little tiny mine going down in there.
Just like making a little tiny mine shaft going down, yep. And then a ladder down to the bottom so we could get down and clean the intake. This is the grave of Ira and Leona Proud. They were especially close friends of the family. Ira was my mother's boyfriend before she started going with my dad, and remained close to the family even after my mom and dad were married. Ira was included in a group of young people from the area that went down, took a vacation trip down through Old Mexico and out to Santa Catalina Island and Los Angeles area and back up here. It's in my mother's life history that she wrote that describes that trip. My dad and mother and Ira and Leona would get together once or twice a month and play pinochle and have ice cream, homemade ice cream, and play pinochle. Us kids used to just love to go down to the Proud's house and on card night and have some ice cream and sometimes cookies with the Proud family. One of our trips to Gold Road, Arizona, my dad went over to visit his parents. I have no idea why, but he decided to go over to Gold Road to visit his parents. And on the way back, our old model Ford broke down on the highway, along the highway. And we were miles and miles in either direction from help. And I remember Dad put Clifford and I in a culvert under the road so we could get in the shade out of the heat of the sun while he tried to walk someplace to see if he could find a house or someplace that he could get some help to get the car going again. Never did. He came back to the car and we just sat in the car and waited. And after most of a day, here came Ira Proud and my mother looking for us. Mother had realized that we were way late and probably broken down, and she went down and got her old boyfriend Ira to come and drive her over to Gold Road to find out where we'd broken down. And sure enough, they found us by the side of the road and towed us on into the nearest town where my dad bought a part for the car and got it fixed and drove us back. It was on that trip where I learned to play cat's cradle with the strings. Dad was thinking of anything he could do to keep two fussy boys from tearing each other apart, and probably the car. And he'd found a piece of string in the glove box and made a little loop, and we learned how to play cat's cradle there. That's the first time I'd learned how to play that.
Leaving to his kids and wife goodbye. I love you and I'll miss you, hugs and kisses, please don't cry. He got a prayer every morning before getting beneath the ground. Please lead and make it safe and get me back home again. I was born from a dusty town, and I'm a miner's child. I was raised with a simple life, and we're taught to be polite. We go to church on Sundays, sing choirs, sing hallelujah. The gospel, we say the grace, and we worship with mountain praise. And to swim on the river, catch tadpoles and dragonflies. We climbed up high on the hill and watched the running timberline. We got a prayer every evening as we gather at dinner time. Thank you for the food we take, the blessings in every way. I was born from a dusty town, and I'm a miner's child. I was raised with a simple life, and we're taught to be polite. We go to church on Sundays, sing choirs, sing hallelujah. We read the gospel, we say the grace, and we worship with mountain praise. I haven't seen you for years, got to visit where I used to be. I was met by my daddy, still strong on his 70s. He had a prayer in the